The morning Ellen Ralston drove her first nail into the cracked spine of pew number 7, the sun had not yet cleared the ridgeline above Harlan Creek, and the whole of Caldwell, Kansas, lay sleeping beneath a sky the color of a bruise turning gold. It was the spring of 1879, and Ellen had been a widow for 14 months. She had not planned to become the unofficial keeper of the Calvary Baptist Church. That role had belonged to her husband, Thomas Ralston, who had loved the church the way some men loved their horses, with a particular tenderness that did not require explanation. Thomas had been the kind of man who noticed when a hinge squeaked and did something about it before anyone else had to ask. He'd been good at noticing things. It was one of the qualities Ellen had loved most in him, and one of the qualities that made his absence feel like a permanent ache in her left side, a low, dull pain she had simply learned to carry. Thomas had died in February of 1878, taken by pneumonia in the span of 9 days. They had been married 6 years. Ellen was 31 years old. The grief had not destroyed her. She had 2 children, Henry, who was 8, and Clara, who was 5, and a small homestead half a mile from the center of town, and a stubbornness that her mother had once called a flaw and her father had called a gift. She kept the farm running with the help of their neighbor's teenage boy, a gangly red-haired kid named Eli who came twice a week in exchange for a hot supper. She kept her children fed and clothed and schooled. She kept herself upright. But on the first Sunday after Thomas was buried, she had walked into Calvary Baptist and noticed that the left armrest on pew number 7 had splintered right through. The wood split clean along the grain. She had sat with her children through the service, watching the splintered wood, and she had thought about Thomas. He would have fixed it before anyone sat down. He would have noticed it Friday and had it mended by Saturday evening. By the time Reverend Holt had finished his closing prayer, Ellen had already decided. She arrived that following Saturday night with a canvas tool roll she had found in the corner of Thomas's barn. Inside were a small hammer, a handful of square-cut nails, a wood rasp, and 2 lengths of sandpaper. She let herself into the church through the side door. Reverend Holt had given her a key without her having to ask for it, pressing it into her palm at the church door one Sunday with a look that contained equal parts gratitude and something close to pity, and she had accepted both because she needed the key, and she walked the rows of pews in the fading light. There were more problems than she had expected. Pew 7's armrest, a split board on pew 3 that would catch a dress hem, 2 loose seat planks near the back that rocked when a person shifted their weight, a hymnal rack with a broken bracket. She had brought only enough materials to fix one thing, so she fixed pew 7 and made a list of everything else. She came back the following Saturday, and the Saturday after that. Within a month, it had become a ritual so fixed in her life that it no longer required a decision. Every Saturday evening, after the children were in bed, she loaded her tools and her small lantern into the wagon and drove the half-mile to Calvary Baptist and worked until the light was gone or until the work was done. Then, early Sunday morning, she returned to finish whatever remained, to sweep the floor and set the hymnals straight and replace the candles if they were low, and when the congregation arrived at 9 o'clock, they found the church clean and sound and whole. Nobody ever asked who was doing it. People in Caldwell, Kansas in 1879 had enough of their own troubles that they tended not to examine a good thing too closely. Reverend Holt knew. His wife Martha knew. Ellen suspected that Mrs. Delaney, who arrived earliest of anyone except Ellen, had figured it out from the wood shavings Ellen occasionally missed sweeping from below the pews. But nobody said anything, and Ellen preferred it that way. She did not do it for recognition. She did it because the church was Thomas's and because keeping it whole was the one concrete thing she could do with the grief that otherwise had nowhere useful to go. She did it because her hands remembered peace when they held a tool. She did it because on quiet Sunday mornings, alone in the church before the sun had fully risen, she felt something close to conversation with a man who was no longer alive to speak. 14 months she had done this. 56 Sundays. She had replaced 11 boards, reglued 4 hymnal racks, rehung a door, re-leveled the altar rail where it had developed a lean, patched a hole in the plaster near the east window, and recaned the seat of the chair the Reverend used in the vestibule. She had done it all quietly, early, alone. Until the morning of May the 4th, 1879, when she arrived in the gray pre-dawn dark and found a man already inside. She heard the hammer before she saw him. A steady, confident knock 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 coming from somewhere near the front of the church. She had paused at the side door with her hand on the frame, her lantern throwing a small pool of gold onto the worn plank floor, and her heart had done something entirely undignified. It had leaped, and then immediately pulled back from the leap as though embarrassed. For one suspended moment she had let herself imagine Thomas, kneeling beside a pew with a hammer in his hand, because the mind does strange things in the half-dark when it still carries a wound. But it was not Thomas. The man was broad-shouldered and unfamiliar, kneeling at the end of the third pew with a short-handled hammer and a handful of nails held between his lips. He was working by the light of a lantern he'd set on the seat beside him, and he had already removed the split board from pew 3 and cut a new length of pine to replace it. The new board was pale and clean against the darker, weathered wood around it. He had done a good job cutting it. The ends were square and the fit was tight. Ellen stood in the doorway for a long moment with her own lantern in her hand and her tool roll tucked under her arm, and she watched him work. He had dark hair, a few days of beard, and the kind of hands that knew what they were doing. He wore a plain wool shirt and canvas trousers and boots that had been good once and were still serviceable. There was a saddlebag on the floor beside him and a hat hung on the pew end above it. He had not heard her come in. She said, "That board has been needing replacing since February." The man startled. Not badly, not a frightened jump, but a controlled flinch that said he was the kind of person whose reflexes were sharp and who had learned to keep them from running away with him. He turned from the pew and looked at her, and in the lantern light his eyes were the particular dark gray that the Kansas sky turned just before a storm rolled in from the west, not a threatening gray, but a serious one, a color that paid attention. He plucked the nails from between his lips with 2 fingers unhurried and said, "I noticed it needed doing." "I had it on my list," Ellen said. Something shifted in his expression. Not amusement exactly, but the near cousin of it. "I didn't know it had a keeper." "It has," she said simply, and walked into the church and set her lantern on the first pew and her tool roll on the seat beside it, and knelt down to see how he'd done the cut. It was good work. She ran her thumb along the joint. Tight as it needed to be. "You used a miter box," she said. "Borrowed one from the livery. Caldwell's livery man keeps a good shop." She looked up at him. He had not stood. He was still kneeling at the pew end, watching her examine his work with an expression she could not quite read, somewhere between careful and open. "I don't know you," she said. "No," he agreed. "August Garrett. I arrived 2 days ago." "From where?" "Most recently Dodge City, before that Wichita, before that a spread in the Texas Panhandle." "You're a drover." "I was, looking for something steadier now." He said it without apology or excess, the way a man states a fact he has made his peace with. "I was passing the church last evening and I looked in the window, saw that board and thought someone ought to fix it." "Someone does," Ellen said, "every week." He looked at her for a moment. Then he said, "Mrs. Ralston, Ellen Ralston." "Mrs. Ralston," he nodded a small acknowledgement. "I'm sorry I got here ahead of you, I didn't know." "You couldn't have known," she said, which was true, and she softened slightly because she was a fair-minded woman and it was simply a fact. She looked back at the board. "It's a good repair." "Thank you." They were quiet for a moment, the kind of quiet that has some weight to it, that is not uncomfortable but is not nothing either. The church was dim and still and smelled of old wood and candle wax, and somewhere outside a meadowlark was beginning to understand that morning was coming. Ellen stood up. "Since you've done that one," she said, "I have the seat of pew 9 to look at. The left side is rocking." August Garrett looked at her with those storm-gray eyes, and then he stood up too, which put him at something over 6 feet, and he said, "I'll hold it steady while you nail it." That was how it started. He did not ask permission to stay and help. She did not offer an invitation in so many words. What happened was simply that they both knelt down at pew 9, and Ellen found the loose nail and pulled it with her hammer's claw and set a new square nail in the hole at a fresh angle. And August held the board flat while she drove it home. And then they moved to pew 12, and then the hymnal rack near the window, and they worked together in the early dark for nearly an hour without saying much of anything that wasn't about the task in front of them. And when the light outside began to shift from gray to pale gold, they were both still in the church, and the work was done. Ellen stood up and pressed her hands against the back of her skirt. She looked at the church around them, at the pews sound and level, the floor clean, the hymnals straight. "You're not a church-going man," she said. It wasn't an accusation. August picked up his hat from the pew end. "I haven't been in a while," he said carefully, "but you fixed the pew." "A thing either needs fixing or it doesn't," he said. "That's got nothing to do with religion." Ellen looked at him. He was looking at his hat, turning it slowly in his hands in a way that she suspected was habitual, a thing he did when he was deciding what to say. "The congregation arrives at 9, she said. "That's 2 hours from now. I'll be out of your way." "I didn't say that," she said, and then she was surprised by herself because she hadn't planned to say that at all. She recovered and kept her voice even. "There's coffee at the parsonage. Reverend Holt's wife puts out a pot early. I imagine she won't mind an extra cup." He looked up from his hat. He studied her face for a moment with the same careful attention he'd given the board joint, checking the fit of something. "All right," he said. The parsonage sat directly behind the church, a small frame house with a covered porch, and Martha Holt was already awake and already had coffee going, because Martha Holt was the kind of woman who seemed to exist in a perpetual state of pleasant preparedness. She was 60 years old and had the stout, competent build of someone who had built their life out of practical decisions. She came to the back door when Ellen knocked and looked from Ellen to August Garrett with an expression that moved through surprise and landed comfortably on welcome. "Ellen, come in. And you are," she addressed August directly, not unkindly. "August Garrett, ma'am. New to town. I was helping with the pews." Martha looked at him for 2 more seconds, then opened the door wider. "Coffee's hot. Sit down." They sat at the Holt's kitchen table in the early morning light, and Martha brought 3 cups and a plate of biscuits from the previous evening that were still decent. And Reverend Holt appeared in the doorway in his suspenders with his white hair uncombed, took in the scene, and sat down at his own table with the ease of a man who had spent 40 years, accepting that his wife's hospitality would extend in any direction at any hour. "August Garrett," the Reverend said, testing the name. "You're the man who arrived Thursday on the southbound." "Yes, sir." "I heard Vance at the livery put you up in the barn loft. Temporarily." Reverend Holt wrapped both hands around his coffee cup. He had a direct way of looking at people that was neither threatening nor prying, just honest. "What brings you to Caldwell, Mr. Garrett?" August was quiet for a beat. Ellen watched him from across the table, noticing the way he composed himself before he spoke, like a man who had learned that words once out could not be recalled. "I spent 12 years driving cattle," he said. "From Texas to Kansas, Kansas to Nebraska, wherever the work was. I'm 34 years old and I've got nothing to show for it but a good horse and some money in my boot and a back that knows every mile of the Kishom Trail personally." A pause. "I want something that doesn't move." The Reverend nodded as though this were a perfectly reasonable Sunday morning confession. "There's work to be had here. The Caldwell Land Office is advertising open claims 20 miles east, and Hennessy's Mercantile is looking for a hand since his boy left for Colorado." "I heard about the claims," August said. Martha set down more coffee without being asked. She gave August a look that was measuring in the maternal sense, the kind of look that is simultaneously assessing your character and deciding whether you need to eat more. "Are you a married man, Mr. Garrett?" she asked, and nobody at the table pretended the question was purely informational. "No, ma'am," August said. He did not look at Ellen. Ellen looked at her coffee. Said Martha Holt, in the tone of a woman filing information away for future use. Ellen left the parsonage 20 minutes later and drove home to wake the children and dress them for church. She was aware, on the drive home, of something she hadn't felt in 14 months, something that stirred in her chest when she thought about August Garrett's storm-gray eyes and his careful way with words and the way his hands had held the church pew board steady without being asked. She didn't examine it closely. She put it somewhere inside her where things waited until she was ready for them, and she drove home in the early morning light. He was at the Sunday service. He sat in the back pew, the last row, with his hat on his knee and his back straight, and he sat in the pew that she had watched him repair 6 days earlier, and she noticed that the board did not move at all. Henry leaned over during the Reverend's opening prayer and whispered, "Mama, who is that man in the back?" "A new person in town," Ellen whispered back. "He's tall," Henry said, with the frank appreciation of an 8-year-old. "Hush," Ellen said, and did not look at the back pew again for the rest of the service, though she was aware of August Garrett's presence in the room the way you are aware of a fire burning somewhere behind you, not threatening, just warm, just there. After the service, outside in the spring sunshine with the congregation milling around and swapping the week's news, August made his way toward her with his hat in his hand and his expression politely composed. "Mrs. Ralston," he said. "Mr. Garrett." Henry was watching him with open curiosity. Clara was hiding behind Ellen's skirt in the way she did with strangers, one eye peeking out. "These are my children," Ellen said. "Henry and Clara." August crouched down to their level, which was a thing Ellen noticed because not everyone thought to do it. He looked at Henry man to man, which was exactly what Henry required. "Henry, how do you do?" Henry straightened up. "Fine, sir. Are you a cowboy?" "I was," August said. "I think I might be something else now." "What else?" August considered. "Don't know yet, still working that out." Henry seemed to find this an acceptable answer. Clara had retreated fully behind Ellen's skirt and was no longer visible. August looked up from his crouch to Ellen's face with a quiet smile, and then he stood. "I was wondering," he said, "if there were any general repair work around town I might ask after, anything besides the mercantile." It was a practical question, and he meant it practically. But he was asking her, and she knew it. "Jim Vance at the livery has been saying his roof needs attention," she said. "And the schoolhouse needs its front step rebuilt. You could speak to the school board about that. That's Frank Delaney, the man with the gray vest, talking to the Reverend there." August nodded. He looked at the schoolhouse, a white-painted frame building at the corner of Main and 2nd, and then back at her. "Thank you," he said, and the words were plain and direct and meant what they said, and then he put his hat on and went to introduce himself to Frank Delaney. Ellen watched him go. Beside her, Henry watched him go too. "I think he's going to stay," Henry said, with the certainty of an 8-year-old who had developed opinions about what Caldwell needed. "You don't know that," Ellen said. "I think so," Henry said. The weeks that followed had the quality of a river beginning to change course. Not dramatically, not suddenly, but with the patient inevitability of water finding a new way. August Garrett fixed the livery roof in 3 days and charged Jim Vance a fair price. He rebuilt the schoolhouse's front step over the course of a long Saturday with lumber from the mill on the north side of town. And he did it so well that Frank Delaney told his wife Margaret that it was the best carpentry work Caldwell had seen since Thomas Ralston died, which was true, and which Margaret Delaney relayed to Ellen at the dry goods store, watching Ellen's face carefully as she said it. Ellen received the information without expression and said, "I'm glad the step is fixed," and bought her yard goods and drove home. August took a room at Mrs. Brody's boarding house on 2nd Street, because after 2 weeks in the livery loft it was clear he was staying, and the loft was cold at night, even in spring. Mrs. Brody's house was a plain 2-story with 4 letting rooms and a dining room where she served supper at 6 o'clock for her boarders and occasionally for guests if she was in a good mood. She was a brisk, sharp-tongued woman in her 50s who disapproved of weakness in any form and had an unexpected soft spot for quiet, capable men. By his 2nd week there, she was setting aside the thicker piece of pie for August at supper, which was, by the social economy of Mrs. Brodie's house, a significant honor. Ellen knew he had taken a room there because Caldwell was not a large town, and information moved through it the way water moves through sand, quickly, thoroughly, leaving no dry spot untouched. She knew that he had started working for Hennessy's Mercantile 3 mornings a week, loading and unloading freight and making deliveries to the outlying farms, and that he was also investigating the open land claims 20 miles east and had made one trip out to look at the land. She knew he had bought a used plow, which was perhaps the most definitive statement a man in Kansas could make about his intentions. She knew all of this the way women in small towns know things, through the fabric of conversation, through passing mentions, through the accumulative detail of a community that noticed its own. She did not seek out information about August Garrett specifically. She simply received it when it arrived, and she was honest enough with herself to admit that she received it with more attention than she gave to other arriving information. She also knew, because she was a woman of clear sight and practical thinking, that what she was feeling was dangerous in a particular way. Not dangerous in the way of being reckless or improper, but dangerous in the way of being real. Real things, she had learned, had the power to cost you greatly. She had loved Thomas Ralston with the full weight of herself, and she had been right to. And then he had died and taken a portion of that self with him, and she had spent 14 months carefully reconstructing the rest. She was not interested in offering herself again to something that could be taken away. She was interested in her children and her farm and the quiet work of her Saturdays in the church, where nothing was asked of her heart. But August Garrett kept arriving first. Not every Sunday. The second Sunday of May she arrived at the church at 5:30 in the morning and found herself alone, and she felt 2 contradictory things simultaneously, relief and disappointment, and she was not pleased with either. But the following Sunday he was there ahead of her again, working by lantern light on the window casing of the east window, which had developed a crack along the bottom rail. He had brought proper window putty this time and a putty knife, and he was working steadily and carefully. Ellen stood in the doorway again, watching him. He knew she was there this time, she could tell by the slight shift in his posture, but he didn't turn around immediately. He finished the bead of putty he was laying before he looked up at her. "Good morning," he said. "Good morning." She came in and set down her things. She looked at the window. "That crack has been there since March." "I saw it last week," he said. "Had to get the right putty." "You planned ahead." He looked at her steadily. "Mostly I do," he said, and there was something in the way he said it that was not quite about the window, and Ellen felt her composure shift in a way she chose not to acknowledge out loud. They worked together again that morning, and this time they talked while they worked. Not deeply, not yet, but in the easy back and forth of 2 people who have decided, without formally deciding anything, that conversation between them is permissible. He asked her how long she had been in Caldwell. She said she had come here with Thomas in 1873 from Indiana when they were young and the territory was new and everything had seemed possible in the way only very young people and new land could together achieve. "You were from Indiana originally," he said. "Terre Haute. My father had a dry goods store." She paused. "Thomas was from Missouri." She said Thomas's name carefully, testing the air, watching what happened to it. August received the name without visible discomfort, without the particular careful avoidance she had sometimes seen in people who didn't know how to speak of the dead. "What was he like?" August asked. He was smoothing putty along the lower edge of the window frame. He didn't look at her when he asked. The question was gentle and completely serious. Ellen was quiet for a moment. She was cutting a new length of trim molding to replace a section that had warped. "He was a noticing kind of man," she said finally. "Things that needed doing, he noticed them. Things that were wrong or hurting in the people around him, he noticed those too. He didn't always know what to say about them, but he saw them." She ran the trim through her hands. "He was patient. Much more patient than I am. He never raised his voice to me in 6 years of marriage, not once, and there were times I think I gave him reason to. A small, unsentimental smile. He was a good father. Henry was 4 when he died, and he still talks about him every week. August was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "He sounds like a man worth talking about." "He was," Ellen said simply. They worked in silence for a while after that, but it was a different silence than before, the kind that follows honest speaking and feels like cleared ground. That morning over coffee at the Holts, which had become, quietly, a standing arrangement, Martha asked August about the land he'd looked at east of town, and August said he was considering filing the claim, but that dry farming in Kansas was a different proposition than cattle ranching, and he wanted to be sure he understood what he was committing to before he committed to it. Reverend Holt told him to speak to Cy Larson, who had been farming that eastern soil since 1874 and knew its personality better than anyone. Ellen, who had been listening from across the table, said, "Cy Larson is also the best source of information about winter water. The eastern claims have a creek that runs strong in spring and goes shallow by August. You want to know where it holds longest before you decide where to put a house." August looked at her. "You know the Larson land. Thomas and Cy were friends. I've ridden it." "Would you show me?" he asked, and then seemed to hear himself and added with a slight care, "If it wasn't a trouble, I'd welcome an informed guide." She looked at him across the table. Martha Holt was doing something very deliberate with her coffee cup that involved not looking at either of them. "It wouldn't be a trouble," Ellen said. They rode out the following Saturday, which was the first Saturday in June. Ellen left Henry and Clara in the care of Martha Holt, who had offered without being asked, and with a promptness that suggested the offer had been prepared in advance. Ellen drove her wagon and August rode alongside on his horse, a solid bay gelding named Wheeler, whom August had had for 3 years and spoke about with the quiet affection of a man who has found one dependable thing in an unreliable world. The Larson claim was 22 miles east of Caldwell, a broad sweep of short grass prairie broken by a cottonwood-lined creek and 2 low limestone ridges. Cy Larson met them at his fence line, a raw-boned Norwegian-American in his 50s with permanent squint lines from 40 years of facing the Kansas sun. He shook August's hand and nodded at Ellen, and showed them the property without fuss, pointing out the creek's behavior across seasons with the precise and unsentimental knowledge of someone who had earned it the hard way. "It goes down to knee-deep by end of August," he said. "But it holds. You got a spring on the north ridge that I suspect feeds it. If you sink a well on the east side of that ridge, you'll have water year-round." He looked at August appraisingly. "You know how to farm." "I know cattle," August said. "I'm learning the rest," Cy grunted. "Honest answer. Come look at the soil." They spent 3 hours on the land. Ellen walked much of it with them, reading the landscape with a farmer's eye that she had developed in 6 years of running the Ralston homestead, noting the grass types and the drainage patterns and the protection the limestone ridges would offer from the north wind. August listened to both her and Cy with equal attentiveness, asking questions that were precise and sensible. On the ride back in the late afternoon, the light was coming from the west and painting the grass in shades of amber and copper, and August rode beside her wagon with one hand loose on Wheeler's neck and his face turned toward the horizon, and Ellen thought that he had the look of a man who was deciding something very large and very carefully, and she thought she understood that feeling. "It's good land," she said. "It is," he agreed. "The isolation might be hard in the first years." He turned his head to look at her. "I've been alone on cattle drives for 12 years, Mrs. Ralston. Isolation I can manage." "It's different when it's your own land," she said. "When you're alone on someone else's cattle drive, you're still part of something larger. When you're alone on your own land, you're just alone." He was quiet for a beat. "Is that how it felt for you?" After he stopped himself, careful. "After Thomas died," she finished for him. "Yes, the farm was the same farm. The work was the same work, but the weight of it was different. There was nobody to come inside to." The light was very warm, and the prairie was very wide, and her words hung between them in the quiet air, more than she had intended to say, and she felt the slight exposure of having said them. The way truth-telling makes you briefly vulnerable before you can settle yourself again. "I'm sorry," August said, and she believed him, because it was not the hollow, automatic thing people said, but something he meant specifically, something directed at the reality of her experience. "Thank you," she said. They drove and rode in companionable silence for a while after that, and Ellen was aware of the slowly building warmth between them as a physical thing, like the sun on her left arm, steady and present and increasing. She had her children to collect from Martha Holtz, and the evening to manage, and she was not a woman who rushed herself toward things she wasn't sure of. But she was honest with herself enough to know that something was happening, and that she was not when she examined herself clearly against it. The following Saturday, August came to the church in the pre-dawn dark and found her already there, working on the vestibule door, which had been sticking in the summer humidity and needed its latch plate adjusted. She heard him coming this time, the sound of his boots on the path, which had become a familiar sound, and she did not pretend she hadn't. "You beat me today," he said from the doorway. "I woke early." He came in and picked up the spare tools and without discussion moved to the back of the church where one of the rear pews needed a new crosspiece beneath the seat. They worked at their separate tasks for a while, and the church was full of the sounds of careful work, the knock of a hammer, the scrape of a tool, the small satisfactions of wood and metal yielding properly. Then August said from the back of the church, "I filed the claim." Ellen set down her screwdriver. "When?" "Thursday, at the land office." A pause, the sound of a nail being set. "I put the stake on the east side of the North Ridge, where Larson said the well site would be." "That's good," she said. "That's the right place. I'll start clearing the building site next week. Another nail driven home. It'll take the summer to get a house up, but I want to be on the land before winter." Ellen turned back to the latch plate. She was aware of something settling in her chest, something that had the specific quality of a good decision being confirmed by events. He was staying. He had filed the claim. He was planting himself in Kansas soil the way you plant a thing you intend to keep. "You'll need help with the framing," she said. "People here will help with that if you ask." "I'll ask," he said. They worked until the light was good enough to see by without the lanterns, and then they cleaned up and walked to the parsonage. And over coffee, August told Reverend Holt about the land claim, and Holt said he would mention it in the announcements before the service, because that was the way Caldwell welcomed someone who was putting down roots, by making it public, by letting the community receive it. At the service that morning, Reverend Holt announced that August Garrett had filed a claim on the eastern land and intended to build and farm it. And there was a small murmur of approval through the congregation that was the particular sound of a community recognizing that it was growing, that new roots were being put down, that the place was continuing. Ellen sat in her usual pew with Henry on her left and Clara on her right and did not look at the back pew, where she knew August was sitting. Henry leaned over and said, in a whisper that was not quite quiet enough, "So he is staying." "Apparently," Ellen said. Henry smiled with great satisfaction and faced forward. June moved through Caldwell like a slow and generous river. The days were long and warm, the kind of warm that is the prairie's best argument for itself, and the world had the yellow-green brightness of a place at the height of its power. Ellen's kitchen garden was coming in strong peas and early beans, and the onion rose that Thomas had always planted in April, and that she still planted in April because the timing was right, and because some habits were worth keeping. August Garrett was at the land claim more days than not, clearing scrub and breaking sod with the help of Cy Larson and 2 hired men from town. Ellen saw him on Sundays at church and on Saturday mornings in the pre-dawn hours in the church, where their weekly repair sessions had become something she thought about on Thursday afternoons, and again on Friday evenings, and again on waking on Saturday morning. She was not hiding what she was feeling from herself. She had passed the stage of not examining it some weeks ago. What she felt was clear. She liked August Garrett with a thoroughness that had moved past casual liking into something more specific and more serious. She liked his steadiness and his quietness, and the way he used words economically, so that when he said something you knew he'd thought about whether it needed saying. She liked his hands and the way he worked and the way he'd crouched down to look Henry in the eye. She liked that he had asked her what Thomas was like and had listened to the answer. She was also frightened, in the way of someone who has learned exactly what can be lost. It was Henry who moved things forward, because Henry was 8 years old and had not yet learned the adult art of waiting. It was the first Sunday of July, a hot still morning with cicadas going in the cottonwoods near the creek, and after the service there was a church picnic on the grounds, a regular summer event, families spreading blankets and sharing food in the grass beside the church. Ellen had brought fried chicken and corn bread and a jar of pickled beets, and she was setting things out on a blanket when Henry disappeared, which was not unusual, and then reappeared leading August Garrett by the arm, which was unusual. "Mama," Henry said, with the complete transparency of a child who believes he is being subtle, "I invited Mr. Garrett to eat with us because he came alone, and that's not right." Ellen looked at August, who was wearing an expression that was very carefully neutral but contained, she thought, a suppressed degree of warmth. He was letting the boy lead him, which meant he had made his own decision about whether to resist the invitation. "Henry," Ellen said. "He had nothing but a biscuit for breakfast," Henry added, which was probably not accurate and was definitely irrelevant but was Henry's attempt at a humanitarian argument. "It's all right," August said, addressing Ellen directly. "I can find another spot." "No," she said, and then to herself, "there it is again. No, sit down, there's more than enough." He sat on the edge of the blanket, and Clara immediately crawled into his peripheral space and began showing him a collection of rocks she had found near the fence that morning, laying them out one by one on the corner of the blanket, with a running commentary that Clara delivered to everyone exactly the same way, without adjustment for audience. August received each rock with the same level of attention, examining each one as she handed it to him and asking questions. "Where did you find this one? And is this the biggest one?" That Clara answered with great authority and evident satisfaction. Ellen watched him with her children and felt something open in her chest like a window in a house that has been closed too long. They ate in the warm July sun, and Henry told August about a dispute he was having with the Wilson boy at school, presenting his case with some passion, and August listened and then said, without taking sides, "It sounds to me like both of you want the same thing. The trouble isn't wanting, it's deciding who goes first." Henry considered this for a long time and then said slowly, "I guess that's true," with the tone of someone who had not expected to be unsatisfied, but also had to admit the point was solid. After the picnic, when people were gathering their things and the afternoon was turning long and golden, August helped Ellen fold the blanket. This was a two-person operation that required them to stand 4 feet apart holding two ends and then walk toward each other, fold, step back, fold again. And the third time they walked toward each other their hands met in the middle, and they both held the folded fabric at the same time, and neither of them stepped back immediately. He was looking at her. "Mrs. Ralston," he said quietly, not a greeting this time but something else, her name used as a question or the beginning of one. "Ellen," she said, "please." A pause, small and enormous. "Ellen," he said, and his voice had changed slightly on her name, had a weight on it that it hadn't had before. The children were 20 feet away with the Wilson children now, whatever dispute existed apparently suspended in the interest of summer afternoon play. Martha Holt was watching from across the churchyard with the benign fixedness of a woman watching something come right. "I'd like to call on you," August said. Simply, directly, the way he did everything. "If that would be acceptable to you." Ellen looked at the blanket in their combined hands. Her heart was doing the undignified thing again, and this time she let it. She looked up at him. "Yes," she said, "it would be acceptable." He came to the homestead that Wednesday evening, arriving at 6 o'clock on Wheeler with a bunch of prairie wildflowers that he had cut from the land east of town, black-eyed Susans and pale purple coneflowers, and a stem of something yellow she didn't know the name of. He presented them at the door with the slight formality of a man who had decided that the gesture required doing properly, and was therefore doing it properly. Henry opened the door before Ellen reached it, because Henry had been watching the road from the window for 45 minutes, and he said with enormous gravity, "Good evening, Mr. Garrett," and extended his hand. August shook it with corresponding gravity and said, "Good evening, Henry." Ellen appeared behind Henry with her hand over her mouth, trying not to smile too visibly at her son's dignity. They sat on the porch after supper, which Ellen had made carefully, a pot roast with the early potatoes from the garden, and biscuits, and apple preserves from the previous fall. The children ate with them and then went to their beds, Henry reluctantly and with several backward glances. And then Ellen and August were alone on the porch in the July evening, with the sun going down behind the western hills, and the first fireflies beginning their irregular cold lights in the grass below the fence. "Your farm is well kept," August said. He had been looking at it all evening in the way he looked at things, with that attentive readiness. "I try," she said. "No, I mean," he paused, choosing. "I can see what you've done with it. The fence line, the drainage cut you put in on the north side of the field, the way the kitchen garden is laid out. That's not just maintenance, that's thought." Ellen looked out at the farm. She had put 3 years of thought and labor into keeping it alive after Thomas died, and she had rarely had it acknowledged by anyone in those terms, because people generally saw labor without seeing the mind behind it. "Thank you," she said, and meant it fully. "Did you do all of it yourself?" "The young Hendricks boy helps twice a week with the heavier work, but the planning is mine." He nodded. There was a silence that was perfectly easy. "Tell me about Indiana," he said. She told him. And then he told her about Texas, about the drives, about the particular loneliness of the trail, which was different from ordinary loneliness, because you were surrounded by men and cattle and still felt essentially alone in the universe. He told her about the winters in the Texas Panhandle, where the wind came screaming off the Llano Estacado, and the cold was a different kind of cold than anywhere else, a cold with a personality. He told her about his family, parents dead, a sister in Missouri he wrote to occasionally, no other close people. He said it without self-pity, just as a cartography of his life. "Did you never want to settle sooner?" she asked. He turned his glass in his hands. "I told myself the time wasn't right, that I needed more money first, or better land, or the right place." He stopped. "I think the truth is that the right place felt like a thing I had to recognize rather than plan for. And I hadn't recognized it yet." He looked at her when he said it directly, with those storm-gray eyes that did not pretend. Ellen held his gaze and let herself be in the moment without retreating from it. "You recognized it now," she said. "Getting there," he said quietly. After that Wednesday, he came every Wednesday, and then Wednesdays and Fridays, and they found the rhythm of two people who had each been alone for different reasons and had each forgotten, or perhaps never fully known, what it was like to have someone consistently present who was interested in you specifically, not in a role you filled or a service you provided, but in the actual particular person you were. He met her where she was. He did not try to replace Thomas or fill his absence with a constructed likeness. He was his own thing, entirely quieter in some ways than Thomas, more reserved in his laughter but deeper in it when it came, more inclined to observation than Thomas's more active kind of noticing. He was different, and Ellen found herself grateful for the difference, because it meant she did not have to compare. There was nothing to compare. There was only what was in front of her, which was August Garrett on her porch on a July evening, turning his glass in his hands and being genuinely interested in the person she was. He also, she was learning, had a wry and quiet humor that revealed itself slowly, like a spring that was there all along and just needed someone to know where to look. He said dry and perfectly timed things at unexpectedly funny moments that made her laugh in a way she had not laughed in 14 months, a real laugh that came from somewhere deep and felt like water over dry ground. Henry adored him with the straightforward directness of a boy who had needed something to anchor to. He followed August around the farm on the evenings August visited, asking relentless and detailed questions about cattle drives, about the Kishom Trail, about what a trail cook ate and what you did when a steer got stuck in a creek crossing, and whether a person could actually live on beans for 6 weeks. August answered every question with patience and detail, and sometimes he answered the questions in a way that also quietly taught the boy something about work or character without making it a lesson, which was the best kind of teaching. Clara, who had been shy with him at first, developed a trust in him that expressed itself as a kind of comfortable proximity. She didn't talk to him as much as Henry did, but she sat near him, leaned against the porch post near where he sat, showed him things from her world: a feather, a button, a drawing she'd done at school. He received all of it with the same careful attention he gave everything, and Clara, who understood people with an instinct that went beyond her 5 years, had decided that he was safe. And once Clara had decided you were safe, you were simply in her world, folded in, and that was that. The house on the claim was going up in July. On 2 Saturdays, Ellen brought the children and drove out to the land claim to see the progress. And the framings were going up. The walls were going up. A community of men from Caldwell coming out on alternating Saturdays to help with the labor in the tradition of frontier barn raisings that served a practical purpose, but were also, Ellen knew, about something more than wood and nails. They were about community asserting itself, about people saying to one another, "You are here, we know you are here, and we are with you in the fact of your being here." August worked alongside the men without ceremony, taking no special position as the landowner, mixing mortar and hauling lumber and holding boards and driving nails. And Ellen watched him from across the worksite and thought that there was something she needed to say to him, something she had been holding for a while now, and that the holding of it was becoming more of a weight than she wanted to carry. She found a moment in the afternoon when the other men had stopped for water and she and August were briefly alone at the south wall of the rising house. He was checking the plumb of a corner post with a line. "August," she said. He looked at her, the plumb line still in his hand. She had thought about how to say this, and she had decided the only way was directly, because that was how she was made and any other way would feel dishonest. "I need you to know something," she said, "about where I am, so that there's no confusion between us." He set down the plumb line with care and gave her his full attention. "I am not a woman who makes decisions easily about things that matter," she said. "I take my time, and I examine things, and I am careful. That's not coldness, it's just, I have my children and my farm and my life, and I don't make changes to those things lightly. And I have been hurt in the way of losing someone I loved, and that kind of loss changes how you approach risk." She paused. He was listening with his whole self, not interrupting, not projecting, just receiving. "But I am not afraid of this," she said. "What is happening between us? I want you to know that. I am not stepping back from it. I am in it, and I am choosing to be in it, and I think you should know that plainly." There was a moment of very complete quiet. Somewhere behind them, one of the Caldwell men told a joke and several others laughed, and the sounds of a working summer afternoon went on around them. And in the middle of all of that, August Garrett looked at Ellen Ralston with an expression that had nothing of the careful, composed reserve she usually saw there, but only something open and real and a little undone. "Ellen," he said, and her name in his voice had that weight again, the specific weight that was just for her. He stepped toward her and she did not step back, and he took her hand, not grasping, just holding, his fingers around hers, and he said, "I am in it too, completely, just so there's no confusion on your side either." She looked at their hands and then at his face, and she felt the warmth of him and the warmth of the afternoon and the warmth of something that was not yet complete, but was building toward itself with the same steady patience that a good house is built, wall by wall, joint by joint, each piece laid in true. "Good," she said. He held her hand for another moment, And then the men were coming back from their water break, and the afternoon resumed, and they separated to their different tasks. But something had passed between them that changed the air, that made the rest of that afternoon feel lit from somewhere particular. August was sitting with her on the porch 3 weeks later on a late July evening, and the children were in bed, and the night was warm and full of cricket sound, and he had been quiet for a while in the way he got when he was working up to something. "Ellen," he said. She knew before he finished. She knew from the quality of the quiet, from the way he'd been looking at her all evening, from the set of his shoulders which were doing the thing they did when he was deciding. "Yes," she said. He turned to face her on the porch bench. He was looking at her with the open, undone expression she had first seen at the building site, the one that had nothing reserved about it. "I know we haven't known each other long," he said. "I know you're careful, and I know your life is built in full, and I know you've been alone in a particular way, and that asking you to change that again is asking a large thing." He paused, collecting. "But I have not, in 12 years of moving and working and finding nothing to stay for. I have never felt about a place the way I feel about this town, and I have never felt about a person the way I feel about you, and I think that these two things are related. I think you are part of what makes this place the right place." Ellen's heart was entirely undignified at this point. "August," she began. "Let me finish," he said, with a slight smile that was both nervous and steady. "I'm not asking you to decide anything tonight. I want to do this properly. I'd like to court you properly, take the time that taking the time requires, be sure that your children know me and trust me, be sure that you know me and trust me, be sure that I am worth the trust before I ask for it." He looked at her. "But I wanted you to know my intentions, that my intention is toward you. That if you'll have me, eventually, in whatever form that taking means, I want to be where you are." The crickets were very loud and the night was very warm, and Ellen Ralston sat on her porch with the full weight of what he'd said settling over her. And she thought about Thomas, about grief, about the 14 months she'd spent driving nails in the pre-dawn dark, because it was the only way to hold the shape of herself together. And she thought about August's hands on the church pew board, and his eyes in the lantern light, and the way he'd crouched to look Henry in the eye. "I know you," she said. "I have been knowing you since May, every Saturday morning in the dark, and I have been knowing you more since then, and I trust what I know." She looked at him steadily. "And I want you where I am too. I want you to know that too." He let out a breath, slow, like something had been held for a long time. He took her hand and she let him, and they sat together in the warm Kansas night with all the time in the world in front of them and no need to rush any of it. The months that followed were the months of a courtship conducted with care and with joy, the joy of two people who had each known what the absence of something felt like, and who therefore received its presence with a gratitude that was not desperate but was very deep. August came to the homestead 4 evenings a week, and sometimes on Sundays after church. And by September Henry had begun to watch August move through the familiar spaces of the farm, with the comfortable possessiveness of a boy who has made his mind up about something, and is waiting for the adults to confirm what he already knows. August's house on the claim was substantially finished by the end of August, a sturdy, well-built frame house with a central room and 2 smaller rooms off it, a good kitchen, a root cellar, a barn. It was spare and clean and needed furnishing, and it needed life in it, and it stood on its ridge above the creek and looked out over the Kansas prairie with a kind of patient readiness. Ellen drove out to see it on a Sunday in early September. August walked her through the rooms and told her where the window light came from at different times of day, and Ellen walked the kitchen and looked at the layout and the light and thought about how you would work in it, how you would move between the stove and the table and the window. And she was thinking about this as a practical matter and also as something else, and she did not hide that she was doing both. She stood at the kitchen window looking out at the creek valley below the ridge, and August came to stand beside her and they looked at the land together. "It's a good house," she said. "Built it to be good," he said. She turned to look at him. He was looking at her with that open expression. The afternoon light came through the window and fell across him, and he looked like someone who had arrived at last at the place he'd been trying to get to. "August," she said, "I think you should ask me." He was very still for a moment. Then the quiet smile, the real one, the one she loved. "Ellen Ralston," he said, and took both her hands in his. "Will you marry me?" "Yes," she said, "I will." He pulled her toward him, and she went. And he held her the way you hold something you have been careful with, and now simply want to hold. And she pressed her face into the warmth of his shoulder and breathed him in. And the Kansas light poured through the kitchen window and lay over them both like a benediction. They told the children that evening, back at the homestead, sitting together in the main room before supper. Ellen and August sat side by side, and the children sat across from them, Henry with his hands on his knees and his expression doing rapid calculations, Clara with her thumb in the corner of her mouth in the way she did when she was thinking. Ellen said, "Mr. Garrett has asked me to marry him, and I have said yes." Henry looked at August for a long moment. His face was doing something complicated. "So you'd live here," Henry said. "Or we'd live on the land claimed together," August said, addressing the boy directly and honestly. "That's something we'd all decide together, but yes, I'd be with you all the time." Henry thought about this. Then he said with great deliberate seriousness, "You'd be my stepfather." "Yes," August said, "if you'd let me." Henry looked at him for a long time. Ellen sat still and let the moment be what it was, because some things in life needed to happen between a boy and a man without a mother in the middle of them. "Thomas Ralston is still my father," Henry said. "He always will be," August said without hesitation. "That doesn't change." "Okay," Henry said. And then, as if that settled something that had been the only real question, "Okay." And his face opened up and something that had been tight in him came loose, and he looked at August with uncomplicated, unclouded feeling. Clara said, from the corner of the room, "I think it's good," with the finality of someone who has been observing carefully and has reached a conclusion. Then she got up and went to August and climbed into his lap with complete matter-of-factness, and that was Clara's answer. And August put his arm around her and looked at Ellen over the top of Clara's head with an expression that was the most undone and the most content thing she had ever seen on a human face. They were married in October of 1879, on a Sunday, in the Calvary Baptist Church. Reverend Holt performed the ceremony, and Martha Holt cried happy tears from the first pew. The church was full, every family in Caldwell and several from the outlying claims, because when a community has watched something unfold, it turns out for the resolution. The women had decorated with late-season wildflowers and the remnants of summer's abundance, and the church smelled of beeswax candles and chrysanthemums, and the old wood of pews that had been mended and tended for 2 years by careful hands. Ellen wore a dress of gray-blue wool that Martha had helped her make, with a collar of white cotton, and her hair done up in a way that Clara had demanded the privilege of helping arrange, with the result that it was slightly more elaborate than Ellen would have chosen, but was very dear to her because of whose hands had arranged it. August stood at the altar in a dark coat he'd had made by the tailor on Main Street, and his boots were polished and his dark hair was combed, and his storm-gray eyes when she walked up the aisle were absolutely unguarded. And Ellen, walking toward him with Henry on one side and Clara on the other, felt the full weight of the moment, the grief that was still present, always would be, and the joy that was also present, not in competition with the grief but alongside it. Because that was how life actually worked. Not replacing what was lost but building, on the ground of loss, something new and real and true. At the words "I do," said in her voice clearly and without hesitation, she heard Henry exhale beside her, long and satisfied, like a person finishing a long piece of work. They moved to the land claim house in early November, all of them together. The homestead was rented to a young couple who'd come up from Texas, just as Ellen and Thomas had once come west with their youth and their hope. Ellen drove her furniture and her tools and her kitchen things in the wagon, and August rode Wheeler alongside, and the children rode in the wagon bed with the household contents around them, and Clara fell asleep on top of a rolled quilt before they were 5 miles out. The house on the ridge absorbed them. It became a home the way homes do, not all at once but by degrees, by the first supper cooked in the kitchen and the first fire in the hearth, and the first morning with the early light coming through the east window in August, already awake beside her, and the sound of Henry moving around in his room and Clara's voice beginning its day. Ellen did not give up the church. She discussed it with August, one evening in November by the fire, after the children were in bed. She told him that she had something she needed to keep doing, that the church was still her Saturday morning, still hers to care for in that particular way. He listened and then he said, "Then I'll come with you." She looked at him. "If you'll have me," he said. "I've been coming anyway, we might as well go together." She reached across and took his hand. "Yes," she said, "come with me." And so the Saturday mornings in the church became a different thing, not solitary anymore but shared, the two of them in the pre-dawn quiet with lanterns and tools and the particular piece of a place that needed care and was receiving it. They worked side by side the way they had from the very beginning, on that first May morning when he had looked up from the pew board with nails in his lips and she had said, "That board has been needing replacing since February." There was something right about it, about the circularity of it, that they kept returning to where they had begun, that the thing that had brought them together was the thing they continued to do. The church stayed sound and whole. The congregation arrived on Sundays to find their pews solid, their hymnals straight, their candles fresh, their door opening smoothly, and if they ever wondered how all this was managed so quietly and so well, they had mostly made their peace with the answer being right there in the third pew from the front, where Ellen and August Garrett sat with their children on either side of them, looking like what they were, which was a family that had been made from equal parts work and love. The winter of 1879 to 1880 was a hard one in southern Kansas. The cold came down from the north in December with serious intent, and the creek on the Garrett claim froze solid by Christmas, which was within the range of normal but not the easy end of it. August had put up enough hay and feed and firewood in the autumn that they were prepared, and the root cellar held its stores, and the house was well built and held the heat well, and they were secure in a way that was not comfortable and not comfortable being comfortable, because the prairie did not permit complacency, but was genuinely all right. Christmas was warm inside the house in the best sense. Martha Holt and the Reverend came out on Christmas Day, which was a long cold drive in the buggy but which Martha Holt would not hear of skipping, and they brought a smoked ham and 2 pies, and Ellen had made bread and preserved plum cake, and they ate together at the big table that August had built from the good Kansas walnut he'd had milled in the fall. And afterward Henry sat near August and talked about the cattle and the spring planting with the seriousness of a boy who had decided he had a stake in these things, which he did. In January, when the cold was deepest and the nights were 15 hours long, Ellen told August that she was expecting a child. She told him in the kitchen by lamplight, when the children were in bed and the house was quiet and the wind was pressing at the north window in that muted, insistent way of the Kansas winter. She had known for 3 weeks and had wanted to be certain before she said anything, and she had been certain for a week and had been carrying it warm inside her. She said, "August." He looked up from the accounts book he'd been going over. "I'm expecting," she said. He went very still. And then something came across his face that she had never quite seen before, something so unguarded and so full that she felt it hit her in the center of her chest. He stood up from the table and came to her and took her face in his hands and looked at her for a long moment, his storm-gray eyes bright in the lamplight. "Ellen," he said, and her name in his voice was everything gratitude, joy, the particular tenderness of a man who had not expected to be given something this large. "September," she said. He pulled her close and held her, and she felt his breath slow and even against her hair, and outside the wind moved against the house, and inside the lamp burned steady and warm. Henry took the news with a considered deliberateness that was very him. He said, "A baby," in the tone of someone receiving important new intelligence, and then he was quiet for a moment, and then he said, "I'll help," with such absolute conviction that Ellen had to look away to collect herself. Clara said with immediate certainty, "I want a brother." "We don't get to choose," Ellen told her. "I still want a brother," Clara said. The spring came back to Kansas in March, slow and muddy, and then suddenly bright, the way Kansas springs always came, as though the land had been saving its enthusiasm. The creek came up and ran clear and cold over its limestone bed, and the wild plums bloomed along the ridge in early April, small white flowers on black thorny branches, extravagant against the pale blue of the sky. August broke soil for the first planting with his new team of draft horses. 2 big roans he'd traded for in the early spring, a mare named Hazel and a gelding named Bede. And Henry was alongside him half the time, learning to handle the lines, his small hands serious on the leather. The boy had a natural feel for it. August told Ellen that evening with quiet pride that Henry had the instinct for it, the patient attentiveness to what the horses were feeling under the lines. Ellen sat on the porch and watched her son walk the field with his stepfather in the long April light, and felt something that she had not entirely felt since Thomas died, something that was not just contentment or gratitude but something larger, a sense of her life as a whole thing again, a thing with all its parts present and working and connected. Not the same life it had been. A different life, with different shape, but whole. She thought about Thomas sometimes. She thought about him at the church, Saturday mornings, when the smell of the wood was the particular smell it had been when he'd been alive to notice it. She thought about him when she watched Henry move with a certain set to his shoulders that was purely Thomas's, or when Clara said something clever and sharp that was the echo of a quality Thomas had had. She held him in her alongside the life she was living now, and the two things did not conflict in her anymore, the way they had in the first months of grief when any joy had felt like a betrayal. She had been in Caldwell long enough and had known enough people who had lost and continued to understand that continuation was not disloyalty. Continuation was, in fact, the deepest kind of tribute to go on, to build, to love again. August's first planting went into the ground in April. Wheat mainly, and a portion of corn, and a large kitchen garden that Ellen had planned, and that they planted together over the course of a long, warm Saturday, the children running between the rows doing more chaos than help. And August telling Ellen about the time on the trail when a cook named Dell had insisted on growing tomatoes in a tin, nailed to the side of the chuck wagon, and had been so fiercely protective of them that the entire outfit of 16 drovers had walked around that can for 400 miles. Ellen laughed, and August watched her laugh with that expression he had when he thought she didn't notice him watching deeply, quietly glad. "You should have written all of it down," she told him. "All of it that drives the people. Who would read it?" "Henry would read it," she said. "Eventually everyone would read it. That world is ending, August. The open range, the drives, it won't be the same in 10 years. Someone should record it." He thought about that. He had a writer's eye. She had learned the noticing capacity that translated naturally into words when he could be prevailed upon to use them. "Maybe in the winter," he said, "when there's less to do." "In the winter," she agreed, and she meant it as a promise on his behalf that she intended to hold him to. The summer of 1880 was warm and generous. The wheat came in well, the first real harvest from the Garrett land, and it was not a large harvest first-year ground, newly broken, did not give everything it had. But it was solid and honest, and August stood in the field the evening before cutting and looked at the grain heavy on the stalks in the late light with an expression Ellen had learned to recognize as the face he made when something was confirmed that he had hoped for but had not been willing to assume. She stood beside him and he put his arm around her shoulders, and she was very round by then, 8 months along, and she leaned into him and they stood in the warm evening and looked at their field. "Next year it will give more," she said. "It will," he said. "The second year is always better. The ground needs a year to understand what you're asking of it." She thought that was probably true of more things than wheat. Their son was born on the 22nd of September, 1880, in the house on the ridge above the creek, with the midwife Mrs. Callahan attending and Martha Holt present because Martha Holt was present at all significant events in Caldwell, by right of long service and sheer force of character. August sat outside the bedroom door for 4 hours in a state of controlled anxiety that expressed itself as a very thorough cleaning of his boots, and Henry sat beside him for 2 of those hours not saying anything but being present, which was, by then, the thing Henry knew to do. When Mrs. Callahan opened the door and said, "A boy, Mr. Garrett, and they are both fine," August stood up so fast he knocked the chair back, and Henry, who had been 9 for 1 week, let out a whoop that could be heard from the kitchen where Clara was asleep on Mrs. Holt's lap. The boy was Thomas James Garrett. Thomas for the man who had built the foundation of this family, and who was in it still, and James for August's father. He was a solid, red-faced, noisy baby who slept in short, determined bursts and was awake and demanding the rest of the time. And Henry, who had claimed in advance to want nothing to do with babies, could be found sitting by the cradle watching his new brother with an intensity that made Ellen's heart turn over. Clara had wanted a brother and had gotten one, and received this with the satisfaction of someone whose predictions have proven correct. August held his son the first evening with the careful, overwhelmed awe of a first-time father who is very aware that he is holding something more important than anything he has held before, and he sat in the chair beside Ellen's bed and looked from the baby to Ellen and back to the baby with that unguarded expression, the one that had nothing held back. "Thomas James," he said, trying it. "Does it fit?" she asked. "Yes," he said simply. Young Thomas was a farmer's child from the first day. He went to the field in his mother's arms and then, later, on a board rigged across the front of the wagon, and he went to the church on Saturdays in the pre-dawn dark, wrapped in a quilt while his parents worked around him. He was, from his earliest observation of the world, a child who watched carefully and then acted with great conviction, which was perhaps the product of his parentage. The years moved in the way of good years, not without difficulty, because nothing in Kansas in the 1880s was without difficulty. There were dry summers and cold winters and the pressure of debt and the work that never completely stopped. There were cattle epidemics and grasshopper years, and the slow grinding squeeze of the market on small wheat farmers. There were conversations between Ellen and August at the kitchen table, late at night by lamplight, about money and plans and what the next year needed to look like. And these conversations were sometimes hard and sometimes frightening, but they were always honest and always shared. And Ellen knew, in those conversations, what was different about her life now from the time before she knew him. Not that the difficulties were less, but that she faced them with someone who did not flinch from them, who sat down at the table with the same steady attention. He gave everything and worked through each problem with her until they had a path. He wrote that winter, as she had made him promise. He filled 3 notebooks with the drives, the country, the people he'd known on the trail, the Cook Dell and his tin can tomatoes, a trail boss from East Texas named Harlan Yount who could read weather better than any instrument, 1,000 details of the life that was already changing and would soon be gone. Henry read those notebooks beginning to end twice, and then a third time, asking questions. August answered every one. Reverend Holt retired in 1882 and was replaced by a young reverend named Crane, who had just finished seminary and wore spectacles, and had firm views about certain things that Ellen and August did not always share, but found they could work alongside if everyone was honest about it. The new reverend in his first weeks had tried to find out who maintained the church and had eventually, on a Saturday morning in October, discovered August and Ellen at work in the pre-dawn dark, and had stood in the doorway for a moment looking at them, and then said, "I see," in the tone of someone receiving information that recontextualizes many previous mysteries. He had not tried to change anything. He had, after a moment, come in and asked if there was anything he could do to help, and August had handed him the broom, and after that Reverend Crane occasionally arrived on Saturday mornings to sweep, and was always careful to leave the repairs to the two people who knew what they were doing. Ellen and August had been married for 3 years when she found herself, in early 1883, expecting again. She told him in the kitchen again, by lamplight, because that seemed to be the kitchen's function, to hold their most important conversations in its warm, well-used light. He came to her and held her face in his hands again, and looked at her the same way he had looked at her the first time, with that full, unguarded gratitude. And she thought that this was one of the things about him she loved with a completeness she could not have explained to anyone, that he did not become accustomed to things that deserved to be received as gifts. He kept receiving them. Their daughter was born in October of 1883, on a cold, bright fall morning with the cottonwoods below the ridge turning gold. She was healthy and calm, looking up at the world from her first moments with a quality of deep consideration. They named her Ruth Ann Ruth for Ellen's mother, and because August had an aunt by that name who had been kind to him when he was small, and of whom he spoke with fondness. Clara, who was 9, regarded her new sister with the proprietary satisfaction of an older sibling. Young Thomas, who was 3, regarded her with suspicion, and then, within a week, with a devotion that expressed itself as constant proximity and an insistence on reporting to her all important developments in the world around them. Henry, who was 13 and well on his way to becoming a young man, held Ruth Ann on the evening of her birth, with a care that reminded Ellen so powerfully of Thomas Ralston holding newborn Henry 13 years ago, that she had to step out of the room for a moment and breathe the cold October air, and let herself feel both the grief and the joy of it completely, the way you felt them when you were willing to feel them honestly together, as the paired things they had always been. August found her on the porch a minute later. He stood beside her without asking questions. She took his hand. "He looks like Thomas," she said. "When he holds a baby, his expression, it's the same." August was quiet for a moment. "That's a good thing," he said. "Yes," she said, "it is." They stood in the cold October evening, and the stars were coming out over the Kansas prairie, and the light was on in the house, and inside were their children, all 4 of them, Henry and Clara and Thomas James and new Ruth Ann, making the particular sounds of a family in motion, and Ellen felt the fullness of it so acutely that it was almost painful, the way very good things sometimes are when you are fully present to them. She turned to look at August. He was looking up at the sky, that familiar attentive regard turned outward to the stars. "August," she said. He looked at her. "I am happy," she said. "I want you to know that, not in the sense of everything being easy or nothing being lost, but in the real sense, the deep sense, I am happy." He looked at her for a long moment. The wind moved through the cottonwoods below the ridge. "So am I," he said. "For the first time in a very long time I am." He put his arm around her, and she leaned into him, and they stood on the porch of their house on the ridge above the creek, and looked out over the prairie that was theirs. And the night was cold, and the stars were thick, and the house behind them held everything that mattered. In the years that followed, the Garrett family became one of those fixtures of a community that people don't think to name, because the fixture is so fundamental it simply is. August farmed his claim with the steady competence of a man who had found his correct vocation late, but arrived at it fully. Ellen kept her garden and her accounts and her Saturday mornings in the church, and the church on First and Main in Caldwell, Kansas, remained sound and whole and clean, because there were people who cared for it week after week without needing to be asked or thanked. Henry Ralston grew into a man his father would have recognized, and his stepfather was proud of. At 16 he was capable and thoughtful, and had his mother's straight, clear eye and his father Thomas's noticing quality and something of August's quietness that he had absorbed through years of proximity. At 19, he began courting a young woman named Ada Fowler who had come to Caldwell with her family from Ohio, and he courted her with the same deliberate care, an honest directness that his stepfather had shown him by example, without ever calling it an example. Clara grew into a young woman of formidable intelligence and considerable opinion, who read everything she could find and argued with everybody about it, and eventually taught school in Caldwell and later in a larger town to the north, carrying herself with the complete self-assurance of someone who has always known she was seen and valued. Young Thomas James Garrett took to farming with the deep natural affinity of someone for whom the work is genuinely a calling. By the time he was 12, he understood the South Field's drainage better than any adult on the property except his father. He grew up with Auguste's attentiveness, and his mother's practical clarity, and a temperament that was his own, big-hearted and direct and occasionally stubborn, in a way that made Auguste look at Ellen with a very particular expression that conveyed, "Your genes, that." Ruth Ann was quiet and kind and musical, which surprised everyone since neither of her parents was especially musical, but she had a voice that could fill the church, and a way with hymns that made the old women in the congregation dab at their eyes. She sang in church from the time she was 6, and would sing in it until she was very old. On a Sunday in May of 1887, 8 years after the morning Auguste Garrett had walked into the Calvary Baptist Church in the pre-dawn dark, and knelt at the end of the third pew with nails between his lips, Ellen arrived at the church at 5 in the morning, and found him already inside, working by lantern light on the window casing of the west window, which had developed a soft spot in the lower rail where water had gotten in over the winter. She stood in the doorway as she had stood 8 years ago, with her lantern in her hand and her tool roll under her arm, and she watched him work. He knew she was there. He finished the piece of casing he was fitting before he looked up, unhurried, the way he'd always done things. He turned and looked at her from the pew end in the lantern light, with his storm-gray eyes and the ease of a man who has spent 8 years arriving at himself. "You're early," he said. "So are you," she said. The same words they had not said that first morning. Close enough. She came in and set down her things and walked to where he was working and looked at the window casing. "Good job on the fit," she said. "You always say that," he said, "because you always do a good job." He smiled, the real smile, the deep one. He held out his hand. She took it. They stood in the quiet church in the pre-dawn dark with the lantern light warm around them and the rest of Caldwell still sleeping, and all the years they'd made together accumulated between them like well-laid planks, each one solid, each one true. "Ready?" he said. She squeezed his hand. "Ready." And they turned to the work the way they always had, side by side in the quiet, and the church received their attention with the particular dignity of something that has been kept and cared for, that has been given the consistency of love, week after week in the early dark, long before the congregation arrived.